Chapter 4 of The American Plague. Confusion, Distress, and Utter Desolation. Friday, August 30th. The deathly quiet of this Friday morning was shattered by the sharp, echoing boom of a cannon. Several minutes went by, and then another boom rattled windows and shook houses in the city. Under order from Mayor Clarkson, a militia company from nearby Fort Mifflin was hauling a small cannon along the streets of Philadelphia, stopping every few yards to fire off another blast. Actually, the cannon wasn't Clarkson's idea. Governor Mifflin and the state legislature had sent him an urgent note insisting that gunpowder and other salutary preparations be flashed throughout the streets. As the College of Physicians had suggested, Clarkson did not think to use these salutary preparations would do much more than scare citizens. But he knew that the legislature and the governor were in a panic. On August 27th, a much depleted and very nervous Pennsylvania legislature, only 10 of 18 senators and 36 of 72 representatives, had arrived at the State House to begin their work. 2 days later, unease... Hey, we don't fight during reading time. Be kind to each other. Okay? Fight somewhere else. Sorry. 2 days later, the unease turned to fear when they discovered that something terrible had taken place during the night. Their young doorkeeper, Joseph Fry, had died in his bed of the fever. Fry's rooms were in the west wing of the building, not very far from where the senators and representatives met. One reason they had assembled was to find a way to reassure the citizens of Pennsylvania about the fever. But the fact was that the fever had entered their building. That Fry had breathed the same air that they were breathing now unsettled them. The Speaker of the Senate, Samuel Powell, sought to reassure his fellow legislators by getting Dr. Rush's advice on how to avoid the disease. If you can enable me to allay their concerns, Powell told his friends, then the public business would probably proceed. Rush was so busy tending patients that he could only scribble on the back of Powell's note, "I know of but one certain prevention to the disorder, and that is to keep a distance from infected persons and places." This was not comforting news to the governor or the 46 other men crowded in the State House. On the days that followed, the two houses, with its urgings from the governor, rushed through a series of hastily written resolutions. One recommended the improvements of the public health office, while others suggested that the fever had been imported from the West Indies by French immigrants. They also rammed through a quarantine act. Then the state legislature handed over all emergency powers to the governor and adjourned until December. As Assemblyman Jacob Hetzelheimer noted in his diary, the members declined remaining in the city. The governor then turned the entire problem over to Mayor Clarkson, directing him to halt ships from the West Indies for inspection and to do everything possible to allay the public inadequate and effectually remove its cause. He did not tell Clarkson how to do any of this, and did not grant him any special emergency powers or funds. The next day, Governor Mifflin claimed he was feeling unwell and headed for his country home far from the foul air in the state. In effect, the government of Pennsylvania had closed its doors as tightly as any of Philadelphia's shopkeepers had. Mayor Clarkson, meanwhile, faced mounting problems. The mayor showed up at the city hall every day to learn what new crisis had developed, meet visitors, and consider options. But there was little he could do. Every day, more and more city officials failed to show up at work: judges, clerks, aldermen, and secretaries. Orders had been issued to clean up the streets and patrol the wharves, but few people were around to carry out such orders. One day, 30 ships arrived, 13 of them from the West Indies, but no one was available to stop them from docking and just discharging passengers. The bodies of the indignant dead were carted to the Potter's Field and dumped, but no grave diggers were there to bury them. Mayor Clarkson's greatest concern was the mounting number of penniless people in Philadelphia. As well-off citizens closed their businesses and fled the city, they had left behind thousands of individuals without any source of income. When these people became ill, they had no money to pay for food, medicine, a physician, or a nurse. A city almshouse on Spruce Street was jammed with over 300 paupers, while private institutions such as Friends Almshouse were all filled to capacity. Desperately ill paupers were wandering the streets or abandoned in their homes, and no one to take care of them. Even the Pennsylvania hospital barred fever victims because it feared that the crowded conditions of the building would allow the disease to spread widely. Adding to Philadelphia's concerns was a new problem. Many nearby farmers were refusing to bring food into the diseased city. The little food that did make it into the markets was extremely expensive, sometimes costing 2 or 3 times as much as it had before the fever struck. Soon after, Mayor Clarkson heard Rush's news that yellow fever had reappeared. He tried to address the problem of indignant individuals. He summoned the overseers and guardians of the poor, the only official group then dealing with the poor of Philadelphia and surrounding areas. 6 overseers managed the almshouse and were responsible for what went on inside the building, while 14 guardians took care of those who were in need outside the almshouse. The situation was grave, Clarkson told the overseers and guardians. Sick paupers had to be gotten off the streets and out of the alleyways. Not only did they frighten those who came upon them, but they might be very well spreading this disease. The guardians left the meeting resolved to act, but the results demonstrated how completely disorganized the city had become. The guardians went immediately to Ricketts Circus on 12th Street and High and seized the building. Until John Bill Ricketts had taken his show to Manhattan for the summer, his circus had been one of the city's most celebrated entertainment spots, and the showplace for his equestrian talents. Latin teacher James Hardy describes Ricketts Circus as a place to dispel the gloom of the thoughtful, exercise the lively activity of the young and gay, or to relax the minds of the sedentary or illustrious trader. 7 sick persons were scooped up from the street and deposited at Ricketts. The only trouble was that no one could be found to care for them. The sick lay in the stifling hot building, unattended, calling out for water, moaning pitifully, and vomiting on themselves. Matthew Carey took up the story. Of these, 1 crawled out onto the commons where he died. 2 died in the circus. 2 bodies were removed, but the others lay in the state of putrefaction above 48 hours. Ricketts was located in a quiet residential area, many blocks away from the docks where the pestilence first struck. The pitiful sounds coming from the circus and the sight of the dead fever victims did not exactly dispel the gloom of the households nearby. They demanded that the sick be moved and the corpses be disposed of properly. And they threatened to burn the place down if actions weren't taken quickly. The guardians sent a hauler to remove the foul body, and the driver couldn't get into the coffin by himself. A brave servant girl noticed the man's trouble and, Carey continued, offered her services, provided he did not inform the family of whom she lived, else she would be at once dismissed. She accordingly helped him put the body into the coffin, which was by then crawling with maggots, and in such a state as to be ready to fall to pieces. Ricketts was clearly not in the best place to care for the seriously ill patients, so the guardians decided to find a building with a more isolated area. They chose a large unoccupied mansion called Bush Hill, located on a rolling hill about 2.5 miles northwest of the city. Neither Mayor Clarkson nor the guardians had the legal right to take control of Bush Hill, but the owner, William Hamilton, was living in England at the time. His caretaker, Thomas Boyles, could do little to stop them. Those still alive at Ricketts were moved to the Bush House, and others desperately ill followed. All 11 rooms, plus the hallways and staircase landings, were quickly jammed full. 4 doctors were chosen to care for these patients. 2 of them became ill shortly after being appointed, while the sickness in the town seemed to consume time of the other 2. They did not show up at Bush Hill. They did show up at Bush Hill every so often, but they never established a regular schedule for visits. Meanwhile, volunteers were called to help at Bush Hill, but only one responded. A second-year medical student named Charles Caldwell. He found conditions at Bush Hill limited, crude, and insufficient. The place had been taken over so hastily and with little attention to medical needs that it was a likeliness in miniature of the city at the time. A scene of deep confusion and distress, not to say of utter desolation. And then the situation got even worse. Shortly after this, Carey wrote, "The guardians of the poor of the city ceased to perform their duties, nearly the whole of them having removed out of the city. Only 3 remained to see the mounting problems in Philadelphia and administer the Bush Hill. Of the 3 who stayed, 2 died of fever, while the other 2 became sick, too sick to do any of the work. As all of this was taking place, deaths in the city increased from 19 in September, on September 1st, to 42 on September 8th. Whole city families were swept away within a matter of days. David Flickwer and 5 members of his family perished, as did Samuel Weatherby and his wife and 4 children. Godfrey Gebler lost 11 family members. Many of these people died, Carey pointed out, without a human being to hand them a drink of water and administer medicines or to perform any charitable office to them. Every morning found bodies lying in the streets. Every day a new horror story surfaced. Carey told of a pregnant woman who went into labor even while her husband and 2 children lay dead in the same room with her. No midwife attended her, and no relative or neighbor gave her comfort. She managed to crawl to a window and get a passerby's attention. With his assistance, she delivered the child, which died in a few minutes, as did the mother. By the end of the first week of September, the yellow fever epidemic had driven the state government from Philadelphia and crippled the city's administration. It then struck the federal government with a vengeance. Secretary of Treasury Alexander Hamilton and his wife fell ill with the fever on September 5th and left the city. 6 clerks of the Treasury Department also contracted this disease, leaving just one, Joshua Dawson, at his post. Attorney General Edmund Randolph was away negotiating an Indian treaty, and his department fell to disarray almost immediately. The post office ceased doing business when 3 of its clerks grew ill. Thomas Jefferson, meanwhile, had submitted his resignation, which was to take effect on December 31st because of Washington's neutrality policy, and went home to his estate in Virginia. Nearly everyone, Washington observed with consternation and annoyance, had matters of private concern which required them to be absent. The president recognized the mortal danger federal employees faced and urged department heads to move their offices away from Philadelphia to Germantown, some 5 miles away. A few days later, Washington himself began preparing to leave for Virginia. "It was my wish to have continued in Philadelphia longer," he wrote to his personal secretary, Tobias Lear. "But as Mrs. Washington was unwilling to leave me surrounded by the malignant fever which prevailed, I could not think of hazarding her any longer by my continuing in the city, the house in which we live together, in a manner blockaded by the disorder, which has become every day more and more fatal." On the morning of September 10th, George and Martha Washington headed south towards Mount Vernon. He planned to be away from the seat of federal government for 15 days or so and did not take any official papers with him. In the weeks ahead, he would postpone his return several times as reports reached him that the epidemic was growing worse. Without realizing it, the president had set a constitutional crisis in motion when he exiled the city. Many people, Thomas Jefferson and future President James Madison included, felt that Washington could not legally convene Congress anywhere but within the city limits of Philadelphia. Without Congress to pass the appropriate laws and appropriate money, the workings of the federal government would eventually come to a grinding halt. 2 days after the president left, and even before he reached his Virginia home, a meteorite fell out of the morning sky and thudded into 3rd Street. A meteorite fell out of the morning sky and thudded into 3rd Street. In a city that was falling apart fast, it was seen as an omen. that even worse things were yet to come.